Hello, welcome to this presentation. My name's Simon. I'm in the second year of my PhD at the RNCM, and this presentation is entitled Sound Sculptures and the Interplay Between Acoustic and Electronic Sound. So, as an introduction, this presentation discusses my first two acoustic electronic sound sculptures. Originally intended as a series of live pieces, Sound Sculpture 1 focused on the use of acoustic and psychoacoustic phenomena to achieve various types of sonic interaction in a concert setting. As Sound Sculpture number 2 was produced in lockdown, it took on a different and ironically more collaborative approach to the exploration of acoustic and electronic sound. I intend to make a series of sound sculptures which will form the backbone of my PhD. So what does this presentation look at? Each sound sculpture looks at different aspects of music composition in the following areas. 1. Approaches to blending acoustic and electronic sound. 2. Using space as a primary compositional parameter. 3. Developing original methods of composition and collaboration with players which explore their instruments in fine detail. And this presentation will compare and contrast these areas and then finish by suggesting how future sound sculptures can take these areas further. So that's just a little snippet, but in essence, the core approach to blending acoustic and electronic sound in this piece was through source bonding electronic soundscapes to acoustic instruments. So the idea is that the performer will play a tone and then that is naturally extended into an electronic sounding soundscape which moves across the room. In order to achieve this successfully, the piece had to create a total sense of homogenization between the clarinets and the electronic sounds. So as I started reading into and applying various acoustic and psychoacoustic theoretical concepts in order to achieve this. So things such as harmonicity, synchronicity, beats, and the differing sense of location that different kinds of waveforms will give you were used to homogenize these tones. I don't have time to go into this detail here, but I wrote a blog entry which can be seen here where I do go into more detail about this. I will, however, in the next page just show you how harmonicity works, because that's a key aspect in how this source bonding is achieved in this piece and in a later piece. And the second thing looked at before was using space as a primary compositional parameter. So this piece achieved this by having the musicians placed around the audience, and then sounds were panned around the audience, and the electronics fused with the acoustics to give the illusion of singular tones. The third aspect was developing original methods of composition and collaboration with the players. So the way this piece was made was by recording samples of the clarinet. So this was done a couple of months before the performance, and then these were blended back into the performance. Mainly long legato type tones were used, and this was because I knew I wanted to create a very fused sound between the live and the electronic parts. Here's a screenshot from Ableton which will hopefully illuminate this a little bit. So here in the grey part, this represents what would be the live instrument, and so you wouldn't hear this on playback. And then this part here would fade in very slowly, and this would be the completely same sound as this, although recorded a few days earlier. Then here we'd start to break away from this tone. So this might be part of the harmonic series, or it might create beats, or it might be a similar kind of waveform to create a similar sense of location within the room. And then as you move away from the acoustic sound, these sounds could get further away in various different ways as this is panned across the audience, and then the other player would pick up at the other side. So this is kind of how these soundscapes were created. And exploring instrumentation. So this was a really great opportunity to explore the clarinet, because as explained before, the types of sound were paramount to how the blending occurred, and the clarinet has much flexibility in producing an almost full range of simple to complex spectra. This made it an ideal instrument with which to explore the perceptual qualities of sonic spectra, with the aim of source bonding the electronic sounds to acoustic instrumentation. So this was performed last February in 2020, which was about a month before lockdown, which was quite fortunate. And then lockdown hit, and then I worked on a few different pieces, and I didn't come back to the sound sculpture idea until around October, November time, I think it was. And this was because these pieces were really designed as live pieces, obviously. So without being able to perform things live, it didn't seem like something I'd work on. But then the opportunity came up to work with Weston Alenki, who had done a workshop in the RNCM when it was still open last year, and I always wanted to work with him because he's such an amazing trombonist who can create such an amazing array of sounds. But as we were in lockdown, I couldn't do the sampling session as I did with the players in real life, so I had to sort of invent a new process, which I'll get to in a second. But this involved creating a graphics score. With this piece, I wanted to develop the last one and have more kind of freedom from this idea of blending the acoustic and the electronic sounds. This would give more kind of room for creativity and playfulness. I also wanted to move away from the sound movement and the idea of sound bonding the electronic sounds to the acoustic instruments. And then, just by a funny quirk of fate, two French horn players from the school got in touch with me, Erin Bathgate and Jack Sindel, and they asked me if I wanted to write a piece for them. And I ended up using the same graphic score for these guys as I did with Weston, and ended up creating kind of two pieces, although in my mind I now consider them as kind of two large movements as the same piece, even though they've never met one another. So this is an example of a few pages from the graphic score which I sent to the guys. So they just created improvisations from these ideas. So these aren't completely random. I did have techniques in mind for the brass. So generally speaking, these are kind of mute positions, and then I did a glossary of what I roughly imagine these sounds to be. But I still ended up with very different improvisations from all the guys. From the French horn players, that was a far more playful thing. Each one lasted about 10 minutes, and it was far more kind of off the cuff. But then Weston's was far more kind of meticulous and rigorous, and also well recorded. The French horn piece was kind of done on iPhones and things like that, whereas Weston sent some really pro sounding samples. So I ended up with quite different results. So there are lots of similarities as well. So just for the sake of this demonstration, I'm going to focus on the French horn piece, just with one excerpt. So here on the left is Erin's improvisation, which lasted about 10 minutes, and I also had another 10 minutes from Jack, and I probably threw away about 95% of the material, but as I was listening through, anytime I heard an interesting sound or fragment of music, I'd cut that out, put it to one side, and then come back later to develop it. So here is an example of a little fragment of Erin's improvisation, just the raw improvisation, unedited. So that melody there, I cut that out and then used that as the main fragment of the end section of the whole piece. So the whole piece is about 13 minutes long, so this is just the end bit. But I took that little melody and then slowed it down and then reversed it and then put a few of the other phrases in between to turn it into this longer passage. So then to try and take the ideas from the previous page forward in line with the points you can see at the top of the screen, the idea I was trying to achieve here was to use harmonicity to source bond the electronic soundscapes to the room resonance. So this is just a demo, but imagine those melodies are live French horns, then in the background you have this soundscape. This soundscape is each note from that melody pulled out and then time stretched over like a minute. And then each note is layered on top of each other, and because they all relate to the harmonic series, you get a similar effect to the max patch earlier, although it has a different quality because it's French horns and not sine waves. And then this filter filters out everything but the fundamental. And then over the course of the passage, the filter opens. So the idea is to try and get this sort of swelling, growing effect from the room resonance and room acoustic. These tracks here are different sounds pulled from the improvisation, which are gradually faded in and layered up to create a kind of textural soundscape thing. So the next part of this process became to notate the material in order to be able to play it live. So on the left hand side of the page you see the passage we've just heard, which is notated almost entirely as the demo sounds. But there were lots of other parts, such as on the right hand side, where a whole other process, a whole other draft was created, where these materials were developed further in the notation. It was a really interesting process. For instance, on this part here, Jack started using what he called pinched air, so he wasn't breathing from the diaphragm, just from his mouth. And through this technique, he was able to get some really high notes that you might not expect from the French horn. And there was some really interesting sessions with the players, where they were effectively teaching each other how they'd come up with these sounds, and sometimes they couldn't even remember how they come up with these sounds, so they were having to kind of figure it out. So it was a real exploration of the French horn. So it'd be really interesting to continue this technique with other instruments to see what comes out. I ultimately want to create 5 sound sculptures, one for each of the main instrument families. So I've done the woodwinds one already, nearly finished the brass. I just need to get a performance finished. But we have a recording, a better recording than that demo. We've done a kind of live recording. But yeah, and then next I'd like to do a strings sound sculpture. So the idea and the way of source bonding acoustic instruments to field recordings in this one. This will be how to sort of take that idea further, and creating a sense of space through acoustic sound modelling of field recordings. So really changing the acoustic environment of the audience. This will work well in the new RNCM studio. I also want to do another sound sculpture for percussion, electronically controlled acoustic instruments using robots and stuff like that, and then a final sound sculpture for voices. So I don't mean to suggest that these sound sculptures will be the only thing that I'm doing, but the techniques and methods that I'm developing here will be used to inform other pieces which focus on other kind of aspects, such as collaborations with visual artists. I've got an idea for a trombone concerto, etc. Okay, so thanks for listening. I've got the timer down here that tells me I'm nearly at 15 minutes, so some of that was a little rushed, but thanks a lot.